Hi there, Nicole Smith from Blood and Iron Martial Arts, and I'm here with TJ Sider for part 2 of
Putting the stab in stability. Okay guys, so the next drill we're going to do is moving up into the hip. The exercise is called a hip airplane, and the idea behind this is we're going to try to create some actual stability at the joint itself. A lot of times in HEMA or a lot of times in athletics, one of the things that the hip does is control a lot of what the knee is capable of doing. So if you have knee problems, a lot of that can kind of come out as being a hip issue. We've already started to speak about that with the feet, but now we're going to move on to something a little bit more dramatic. Remember, the hip also is kind of your primary driver of force with both your cutting mechanics as well as your positioning mechanics, your movement in HEMA. So this is kind of really critical for that stuff to unlock some of that power. So what Nicole's going to do then for the hip airplane is start with her feet shoulder width apart, and she's going to move one leg backwards just so that she's standing in kind of a kickstand position, so she maintains her balance. If you have a really hard time with this drill, make sure you've got something stable close by to grab onto, just so that you can maintain your balance. You don't want to fall over, so you get the benefit out of the exercise. So two things. One, this is not just a passive movement. So when Nicole does this and she gets into the same position, she actually wants to start to push her foot down into the ground to make sure that it's active. You're not just leaning, okay? As she pushes her foot, her lead leg, the left one, down into the ground, she's going to try to contract the muscles on the outside of her hip. That forces her whole pelvis and body to rotate. As she comes back down again, after she's held that for a second or two, she can set the leg back down again just to maintain her own stability and regain her balance. So the idea behind that is to make sure that what you're doing is active. Again, tension through the foot, make sure that you've got a good stable platform. Press into the ground, activating all the muscles up the chain, and you can feel the muscles in your butt, your lateral hip, actually fire up to create the rotation in the pelvis and the rest of the body. Okay? Okay, so I know this is what everybody's been waiting for. We're going to talk about core. I hate that word. Okay, because the core is kind of a misnomer. But for lack of a better way to put it, let's just assume that it's the muscles that kind of allow you to transfer force from your lower body through the hip and into the upper body. Think about it more like a transmission as opposed to a big power center. So the reason why, with Blood and Iron in particular, we're always taught to lock your core down when you move is so that you can create a lot of power transfer from the larger moving muscles. When it comes to the core, there's only one guy, in the lower back in particular, there's only one guy in the world that I really care to listen to. Dr. Stuart McGill is the world's foremost researcher on spine mechanics, in my opinion. I don't think you need to go much further than him to find relevant information. That's just, again, my opinion, but it works. So the next exercise that we're going to do for your core, and to make a pun, they are absolutely necessary, is we're going to do the McGill Big 3. So the first exercise I'm going to show you guys is called the McGill Curl Up. Now this is really important because it's not a normal sit-up and it's not a crunch. It's directly targeting the rectus abdominis, so your main abs, the ones in front. And it does this in a really, really gentle way, so you don't engage your lower back. There's no movement from your lumbar spine. So if you have lower back issues, this is safe. In fact, it's probably one of the first things that I'd get you to do if you do have a problem. And the other one is, it kind of takes everything else out of the equation. You don't really get a lot of hip flexor involvement or any of the other muscles that tend to help. Okay, you're not throwing your neck around either. So, all of the normal cheats kind of go away. So what Steve's going to do is make sure that he's laying flat on his back and have one knee bent so that it's up kind of at about a 45-degree angle, just so your foot's flat on the floor next to your other knee. The hands are going to sit just underneath your lower back. They're not underneath your sacrum or underneath your hips where they would be for a crunch to try to protect it. You actually want them kind of just gently in the hollow of your lower back because they're going to be a little bit of a feedback for you as to whether or not you're coming up too high with your curl up. What Steve's going to do is he's going to try to keep or contract his ribs down towards his hip bones. So the abs are going to try to shorten. His shoulders, his neck, and his head are going to come evenly off the ground and just drift into the air. Notice he's not throwing his head forward and he's not trying to come up too high. As he comes up, he's just going to wait until he can feel some small tension or some small change in his lower back, and that's the limit of the range of motion. You'll notice when you're doing this, if you do it right, it should be really, really challenging because most of us are used to trying to cheat with our abs, and you'll get a shaking that happens. Remember back to our first video last week where we talked about shaking at end range of movement or end range motion where the nervous system just doesn't really like it and you're trying too hard? This will happen here with the abs too. There's just not a lot of power there, so you tend to shake. That's normal. It'll go away as you get better at it. So that's your first one. The second part of the McGill Big Three is a side plank. Pretty basic. Most people have done this before if you've done anything active or if you've been taught core exercises, but pretty simple. Couple of key things though. If it's too hard for you, instead of starting off with your feet at full length, like Steve's doing, you can bend your knees, bend your knees and keep your knees on the ground as the anchor point. So it just reduces the lever length and makes it easier. But generally speaking, most people should be able to handle that from their feet. Come up on your elbow, come up on your feet, and squeeze your butt muscles as much as you can. You actually want to clench your glutes. What that does is it, again, prevents any sort of sagging from the hip and allows your obliques and QL, so the muscles in your lower back that kind of control lateral flexion, those to work appropriately. Hold this one for 30 seconds, up to a minute, depending on your ability level per side. And then the last one that we're going to do is a bird dog. Bird dogs are kind of a pain in the butt because most people have a tendency to do these too fast, which defeats the purpose. As a general rule, when it comes to movement, if something is uncomfortable or difficult, we as humans or as athletes, we kind of rush through things just because it's easier. Don't do that with a bird dog. Let your body challenge itself to create some sort of stability, kind of the whole point of what we're doing. So on all fours, hands underneath your shoulders, knees underneath your hips. If you kind of get too long or too wide, it extends the base of support and makes this too easy. So make sure that you're actually flat underneath yourself. The idea then is you're going to try to create length. So opposite arm, opposite leg, extend out at the same time. You're trying to push through your fingertips and push through your heel to create a long, long, long line. Control that movement and then gently set your knee and your hand back down again. Switch sides. When you switch sides, try not to shift your weight if you can avoid it. You'll have a natural kind of desire to do that because it's easier. Do your best not to and try to create that central stability between your hand and knee. Go slowly, 10 to 15 on each side is usually about right for most people. Okay, one more quick drill to kind of tie in the core musculature and the hip stuff that we've done is kind of an often neglected piece, which is your adductor, so your inner thigh. When you look at cutting mechanics in HEMA, and actually a lot of the footwork as well, but cutting mechanics in particular, okay, so just building on the hip stuff that we've talked about and the feet stuff that we've talked about and then the core musculature that we've talked about is something that kind of gets neglected, and that's the adductors, so the inner thigh muscles. One of the greatest resources for this, if you guys have any interest in further reading, is interestingly enough written by a guy by the name of Thomas Myers, who shares a bit of a name with some famous people in HEMA. But the idea behind the adductors' involvement with cutting mechanics is that they're part of something called your anterior oblique sling. But what that is it's a giant diagonal line, basically from your shoulder through to the opposite hip, and then it travels down into the adductors. So when we create rotation, which is where power lives, particularly in the upper body, you have to involve more than just the hip musculature and more than just the shoulders. It has to travel further than that because we're anchored to the ground. And the adductors are largely that missing component. So the thing that we use to train that the easiest is something called a Copenhagen plank. You need a small stool, chair, ottoman, sibling, whatever works that you can have sitting underneath you in order to do this. Start off very, very easily. It's the same position that you do for a side plank. So on your elbow, shoulder nice and stacked over top of it, and your top leg resting on top of whatever object it is that you're going to use for a brace. The longer the lever, obviously, the more difficult this is. So we've got Steve starting off with a fairly short one. His knee is on top of the box. From there, he's going to do essentially a side plank, but now using his top leg to support himself. So he's going to pull his lower leg off the ground into a side plank and just let it float. Try not to brace it against the box. Hold that for a count of 15 to 30 seconds, and then he's going to switch sides. If you're really robust and you think you've got this one, you can slide the box further out and essentially just increase that lever length, putting the box underneath your foot or your ankle and doing the same thing. Again, brace up, lock your glutes, lock that core down, and then create that plank motion. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to address or start to address is shoulder stability. Now, we could do an entire video series on the shoulder alone. It's a remarkably complex joint. We're not going to do that, so we'll start with something relatively simple. The shoulder arm bar or the kettlebell arm bar, you'll see a lot of CrossFit people or kettlebell people do this, is probably one of my favorite entry-level drills into shoulder stability. You can do this with any implement that you have that has weight to it. So a can of soup, a dumbbell, a kettlebell, whatever you have access to. If you don't have access to any of those things, you can actually do this with a shoe. Clench your fist and place the shoe on top of your fist. That'll create something that gives you some feedback. You have to balance it, which means you're going to go very slowly. And if it falls off and you bonk yourself in the head with it, it's not going to do a lot of damage. Don't use a combat boot. So first things first, extend your arm up so that it's sitting above your shoulder and bend one knee so that your foot is sitting flat on the ground. It'll be the same side as the implement. The next thing that you're going to do is make sure that you actively retract your shoulder. So pull your shoulder blades together. That motion, along with clenching your fist, will start to activate all of the muscles inside your shoulder, your rotator cuff. There's a long explanation as to why that happens. Don't worry about it. Squeeze the crap out of whatever it is that you're holding and pull the shoulder blades together. The next movement is to start to roll. The goal being to try to get your chest towards the ground or your stomach towards the ground. So you're going to turn over. Push your foot into the ground and lift your hips off the ground at the same time. Try to create one solid unit so that your shoulders and your hips move at the same time. As they come up off the ground, actively try to pull your shoulder blade back into the socket the whole time. Kick the leg over top of the body and move your other arm out of the way as you gradually try to bring your torso down towards the ground. Keep your head looking at whatever the implement is that you've got. And again, actively try to keep your shoulder blade pulled in. This is where you'll find your limit of range of motion. As you bring your leg over and try to bring your chest towards the ground, you're not going to be able to go much further without either losing the shoe or it's not going to feel stable anymore. When you get to that end point, hold it for a couple of seconds and then reverse the movement. Push your hand into the ground, start to bring the shoulders back across, kick the leg back slowly, and as you move, again, try to actively be pulling the shoulder blades together, creating stability from that joint and holding that implement up at length. Bring your shoulder blades back to the ground, relax for a second, and repeat.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, TJ. It was a pleasure having you.
Fun as always.
All right, well, what's up for next week?
Next week, we're going to build on this foundation. So we're going to start talking about strength and conditioning for HEMA and making sure that even your week is strong.
Awesome. And remember, if you don't put in the training, you're not going to get the result.